The budget line no one questioned. Indiana 1960 to 1964. No one noticed the extra line because it had always been there. It sat quietly at the bottom of the school district's annual budget, printed in the same thin serif font as everything else, labeled with a name so dull it discouraged curiosity. Federal Transitional Adjustment, Miscellaneous. The number wasn't large. $34,000. Not enough to alarm anyone. Not enough to inspire theft. Just enough to survive year after year without a question. Calder Wynn-Korbel was 23 when he first saw it. He had been hired by the South Marion School District straight out of a small state university. Not because he was exceptional, but because he was precise. Calder didn't talk much. He didn't volunteer opinions. He didn't belong to the teachers' union or the local Rotary Club. He read numbers the way some men read faces. His job was simple: reconcile state and federal transfers with district expenditures. Most days that meant checking that chalk orders matched invoices and that bus fuel costs didn't exceed last winter's projections. Indiana was quiet then. The Cold War was something that happened on the radio. But the line didn't reconcile. Calder noticed it on a Tuesday afternoon while the building emptied for a high school basketball game. The federal adjustment appeared twice, once as an incoming credit, and once, subtly altered, as a deferred obligation. It canceled itself out on paper, perfectly legal, perfectly pointless, except the money still arrived. Over the next 6 months, Calder tracked it backward. Not with accusations, not with memos, just with private notes and a cheap mechanical pencil. He learned that the adjustment dated back to a 1957 Emergency Education Act, renewed automatically by a clause no one had bothered to remove. The funds were meant to offset post-war population shifts that no longer existed. The district didn't need the money. The state didn't miss it. And the federal office assumed the paperwork had already been audited. So Calder adjusted nothing. Instead, he reclassified. By the end of 1962, the $34,000 had been legally redirected into maintenance reserves, then quietly allocated to infrastructure reimbursements. Local contractors were paid on time. The district's books improved. No alarms were triggered. In March 1963, a small article appeared in the Indianapolis Star. Rural District reports unexpected budget stability. No names were mentioned. Calder clipped the article and folded it into his ledger. He didn't feel proud. He felt calm. For the first time, he understood something most people didn't. Money didn't disappear because of greed. It disappeared because no one followed it all the way to the end. And if no one followed it, someone else could. The year the numbers learned to travel. Indiana to Ohio, 1964 to 1969. Calder Wynn-Korbel did not leave the school district because of ambition. He left because the line item disappeared. In late 1964, a thin envelope arrived from the state capitol announcing a comprehensive modernization of intergovernmental accounting procedures. The language was cheerful. The effect was surgical. The transitional adjustment was folded into a consolidated fund, scrubbed clean of its history. The money stopped arriving. Calder read the notice twice, then placed it in the same drawer where he kept newspaper clippings and obsolete forms. He didn't panic. He didn't complain. He understood something now. The opportunity had never been the money itself. It had been the gap between offices that assumed someone else was watching. 2 months later, he accepted a position with a regional agricultural cooperative based near Dayton, Ohio. The title was modest, financial coordinator, and the pay barely exceeded what he'd earned before. To the cooperative's board, Calder was simply a quiet Midwesterner with clean references and an unremarkable resume. To Calder, the cooperative was a map. The 1960s had been generous to American farming in strange, uneven ways. Federal price supports, emergency storage programs, transportation subsidies, each administered by different agencies, each audited on different cycles. The cooperative acted as an intermediary, aggregating grain from dozens of small towns before selling it onward. No one tracked the timing. Calder noticed it within weeks. Rail freight reimbursements were calculated quarterly, but storage credits were issued monthly. If grain sat in a silo during the last week of a quarter and the first week of the next, it could be counted twice, once as stored, once as in transit. The system assumed a precision that rural logistics simply didn't have. Calder didn't exploit the error directly. That would have drawn attention. Instead, he built a buffer. By adjusting shipment schedules, delaying some loads by 48 hours, accelerating others by a day, he created a rolling surplus of reimbursable grain that technically existed in two categories at once. The money flowed not to him, but into the cooperative's operating reserves. By 1967, the cooperative was solvent in a decade when many weren't. It expanded storage, hired more drivers, stabilized prices for its members. Local newspapers called it a model of rural efficiency. One article in the Dayton Journal-Herald quoted a board member, "We don't know how we're doing it. We're just steady." Calder never corrected him. In private, he began to receive offers, consulting requests, quiet lunches with men who asked careful questions about compliance and margins. Calder declined most of them. He had learned the danger of visibility. Instead, he negotiated something else. In 1968, he requested a performance-based compensation clause tied to long-term reserve growth. The board agreed, grateful and slightly confused. No one noticed that the clause referenced net reserves after federal reimbursements were posted. By the end of the decade, Calder's personal income had doubled. He lived in the same apartment, drove the same car. But his notebooks had changed. They no longer contained just numbers. They contained patterns. Money, Calder realized, didn't need to be hidden. It needed to be mistimed. Deferred costs, Ohio to Pennsylvania, 1970 to 1976. The first recession Calder Wynn-Korbel lived through did not feel like a crisis. It felt like a delay. By 1970, the agricultural cooperative had grown too stable to be interesting. Federal programs were tightening. Audits were becoming digital. Timing gaps were closing. Calder saw it months before the board did, and when he resigned, they assumed he had been recruited by someone important. In a way, he had. The invitation came from a municipal consulting firm in western Pennsylvania, the kind that advised towns with aging water systems and shrinking tax bases. Calder's role was technical. Evaluate funding structures for infrastructure repairs, especially those involving federal matching grants. The towns were small. Names rarely appeared on maps. Steel had left. Coal was leaving. What remained were pipes laid in the 1920s and budgets written as if growth would return on its own. Calder didn't see decay. He saw deferred decisions. Federal infrastructure grants in the early 1970s were generous but rigid. Towns received money for specific projects, water treatment upgrades, sewer relining, bridge reinforcement. What no one talked about was timing. Grants were awarded based on projected costs, but reimbursements arrived after completion. That gap mattered. Calder proposed a model that seemed conservative. Projects would be phased. Contractors would be paid partially up front, partially upon inspection. Municipalities would issue short-term notes to bridge the gap. Calder offered to structure the notes. By carefully staggering the issuance and retirement of municipal debt, Calder created a situation where interest expenses were reimbursable under federal guidelines, but interest earnings on idle funds were not restricted. The towns earned modest returns on money that technically belonged to future projects. No laws were broken, no funds were diverted, but the towns ended each year slightly ahead of projection. Local papers noticed the improvement. In 1973, the Pittsburgh Press ran a feature titled, "How Small Towns Are Fixing Big Problems Without Raising Taxes." Calder's name appeared once, misspelled. The real shift came in 1974, after the oil crisis. Construction slowed. Projects paused mid-phase. Federal reimbursements lagged. Most consultants panicked. Calder adjusted. Idle funds were rolled into higher-yield short-term instruments approved for public entities. The yields weren't dramatic, but the scale was. Across 6 towns, the interest earnings exceeded expectations by hundreds of thousands of dollars. Calder's compensation, tied quietly to net project efficiency, rose accordingly. By 1976, Calder no longer needed a salary. He accepted equity stakes in advisory partnerships, deferred fees, long-term participation clauses. His wealth was invisible, spread across municipal instruments and consulting vehicles no one bothered to profile. He bought a house with cash, modest, brick, unremarkable. A local headline that year read, "Town finishes water project under budget." Calder clipped it and added it to the folder. He was no longer chasing gaps. He was designing them. Public records, private value, Pennsylvania to New Jersey, 1977 to 1982. The next opportunity did not announce itself as money. It arrived as paper. In 1977, Calder Wynn-Korbel was asked to advise a mid-sized New Jersey county on a problem no one considered financial: records. Decades of zoning decisions, easements, utility maps, and property adjustments were scattered across basements, annexes, and off-site storage facilities. The county wanted order, compliance, something that could survive inspection. Calder agreed on the condition that he be allowed to redesign the system, not just catalog it. What he discovered was chaos disguised as tradition. Property boundaries had shifted quietly over 30 years. Rights-of-way existed on maps, but not on deeds. Utility access agreements referenced landmarks that no longer existed. None of this was illegal. It was simply unresolved. Calder proposed digitization, an unfashionable word in local government at the time. Not computers in every office, just centralized indexing, cross-referenced microfilm, standardized identifiers. The county approved a pilot program. What Calder didn't explain, because no one asked, was that once information was indexed, it could be valued. Banks needed accurate easement data before issuing commercial loans. Insurance companies needed historical zoning records to price risk. Developers needed confirmation that land could be used the way they intended. Before Calder's system, acquiring that information took weeks, sometimes months. Afterward, it took hours. Calder structured access fees, modest, defensible, framed as administrative cost recovery. The county approved them unanimously. Compared to taxes, they felt painless. By 1979, the Records Office was generating revenue. A short article in the Asbury Park Press noted, "County Records Department posts unexpected surplus." No one connected the dots. Calder did. He negotiated a long-term consulting contract tied to system maintenance and expansion. Then he quietly formed a private entity, an information services firm that specialized in structuring public data without owning it. By 1981, similar systems were being requested in neighboring counties. Calder no longer installed them himself. He licensed the framework. His income diversified without changing industries. Still public finance. Still compliance. Still invisible. In 1982, during a routine audit, a junior inspector asked Calder why the records department had become profitable. Calder answered honestly, "Because uncertainty costs more than access." The inspector nodded and wrote nothing down. By the early 1980s, Calder understood the shift. Infrastructure had been about concrete and pipes. This was infrastructure of a different kind. Information that allowed other people to take risks with confidence. And people paid well for confidence. Pricing what others ignored. New Jersey to Florida, 1982 to 1984. Calder Wynn-Korbel arrived in Florida during hurricane season, which was not when most consultants chose to visit. The call had come from an insurance consortium based in Tampa, uneasy about its exposure but unsure where the risk actually lived. Losses were rising, not dramatically but steadily. Small claims, poorly categorized, dismissed as noise. Calder didn't look at storms. He looked at paperwork. Florida's rapid development had created a problem few insurers liked to admit: policies written on assumptions that no longer matched reality. Subdivisions built on reclaimed land, infrastructure shared across jurisdictions, repair costs rising faster than actuarial tables could adapt. Calder asked for access to claims archives. What he found was misclassification. Minor storm damage logged as maintenance. Flood-related issues categorized as wind. The distinctions mattered because federal disaster programs reimbursed some losses, but only if they were categorized correctly and submitted on time. Calder proposed a revision, not of premiums, but of language. Claims would be documented using terminology that aligned with federal reimbursement frameworks. Not fraud, accuracy, precision. The insurers agreed, seeing it as compliance improvement. Within a year, federal reimbursements increased. The insurers' net exposure decreased without raising premiums. They credited better administration. Calder negotiated a participation fee tied to recovered reimbursements. In 1983, a quiet article in the Tampa Tribune mentioned, "Insurers see improved balance after claims review." Calder's name did not appear. What followed surprised even him. Smaller insurers asked for similar reviews. Then municipal risk pools. Then utility cooperatives. Calder wasn't changing jobs. He was applying the same skill to a new layer. Risk, he realized, was not something you eliminated. It was something you described correctly. By 1984, Calder's income no longer depended on any single client. It flowed from systems that adjusted how institutions understood their own exposure. He moved again, not for opportunity, but for distance. Florida was becoming visible. Calder preferred margins where attention was thin. Scale without a name. Midwest and Southeast, 1984 to 1986. By the mid-1980s, Calder Wynn-Korbel had become something that did not exist on organizational charts. He no longer introduced himself as a consultant. When asked, he said financial systems, which sounded technical enough to discourage follow-up. He worked from hotel rooms, county offices, and borrowed conference spaces. His clients rarely met each other. That was intentional. The systems now repeated themselves. Municipal records here, insurance classifications there, infrastructure timing everywhere. Calder wasn't inventing new mechanisms. He was standardizing the old ones just enough that they produced excess value without appearing to. The real shift was scale. In 1985, Calder stopped charging for implementation. Instead, he negotiated residual participation, small percentages of efficiency gains, reimbursement recoveries, or administrative surpluses. Individually, the numbers were forgettable. Collectively, they were not. Money arrived from places no banker would flag as income sources. A water authority in Iowa, a county records office in Georgia, a regional insurance pool in South Carolina. Calder's accountant asked once if this was safe. Calder answered, "It's boring." That year, the Wall Street Journal ran a short piece on page B7, "Public Sector Efficiency Quietly Improves in Select Regions." No names, no theory, just a note that something had shifted. Behind the scenes, resistance began to form. A new generation of auditors noticed that certain municipalities consistently ended projects under budget, that insurance pools recovered more federal funds than peers, that access fees for records were becoming normalized. Nothing illegal, nothing provable, but unusual. In late 1986, Calder received a letter, not an accusation, just a request for clarification from a federal oversight office. Polite, vague, curious. He read it once and placed it in the drawer with the others. Calder had always known this moment would come. Not exposure, attention. And attention was the one variable he could not model. The exit before the storm. United States, 1986 to 1987. The stock market fell on October 19, 1987. Black Monday. Wall Street lost nearly a quarter of its value in a single day. Headlines screamed disaster. Analysts speculated. Brokers panicked. Calder Wynn-Korbel did not notice. He was in a small brick townhouse in suburban New Jersey, flipping through reports of municipal surpluses, insurance reimbursements, and county record fees. Everything he had built, 27 years of observing, timing, and quietly redirecting, was still intact. No sudden crash, no abrupt liquidation required. His wealth was not on the ticker. It was spread across small towns, government programs, and the gaps no one else saw. In the months before October, Calder had quietly sold residual stakes in consulting contracts to trusted partners, finalized exit clauses, and converted the gains into liquid assets. He moved systematically, calmly, with a precision that left him untouched by panic. Local newspapers reported municipal surpluses and small-town efficiencies. No mention of him. A few accountants noticed patterns. Most dismissed them as statistical noise. By December 1987, Calder had withdrawn entirely from active consulting. He retained his knowledge, his contacts, and the networks he had built. He had no office, no employees, no public profile. He walked through small towns he had helped stabilize. Water systems improved, school budgets balanced, insurance claims sorted. Everything functioned quietly, almost invisibly. He understood that true advantage in finance was not visibility, not aggression, but timing, patience, and discretion. One could outlast markets, bureaucracies, and crises if one moved where others did not look. Calder placed a single notebook on the shelf. It contained decades of observations, spreadsheets, and subtle patterns. Not for sale, not for publication. A record of how money moved when no one else was paying attention. He poured himself a glass of bourbon and sat by the window. Outside, the small towns hummed with life, unaware of the quiet strategist who had passed through their records, budgets, and contracts. The world had changed. He had changed with it. And he had left before the storm.